Hello everyone, how are you today? Ready for a new class? I hope so. Um, Today we are going to deepen in the forest and landscape restoration concept. We're going to connect it with the previous class, which is pretty much focused on climate change and the mechanism to solve this big issue, or at least to reduce, mitigate the impact of climate change. And we're also going to connect forest and landscape restoration with other agendas. So my name is Aurelio Padovesi. Nice to meet you again. I'm a PhD student of the Land Environment Resource and Health Program here in the University of Padova. Ready to go? So let's start for the content we are going to see. So first, we are going to make the connection between the things we are going to see, the new things we are going to see in this class, and the previous class. And we are also going to provoke a reflection about the carbon pricing and the impact of that in the restoration agenda. Then we are going to jump to the concept of nature-based solutions. What is that? Have you heard about it? So we are going to see a little bit of that. And then we are going to move to the global forest restoration demand and myths connected to forest restoration. And then we are going to jump in the trying to make a discussion of social needs and ecosystem services and how those two things combine each other or merge each other in the natural contributions to people. Have you heard about this concept? It's a new one. We are going to explore it later. And then we are going to present and discuss the forest and landscape restoration approach, the concept, the implementation, the challenges to implement it, its principles. And at the end, we are going to recap everything with some takeaway messages. So making the connection, we saw in the previous model that Kyoto Protocol is a very important milestone for the climate change because establish a mechanism where industrialized, well, among other issues, is a mechanism where industrialized countries could invest in clean development mechanism. So they establish a cap, a limit of carbon emission, and if they go over this limit, they can trade, they can buy carbon credits. So it's a cycle that once that was the idea of stimulated carbon marketing. And if there's marketing, there's pricing, right? And along this, during this period, we saw many projects, like almost 8,000 projects, um, a lot of money coming to these projects to support this mechanism, to develop the mailing restoration and conservation projects. So projects under the red um, umbrella. But we also saw that that investment was not enough to achieve the goals of Kyoto Protocol. So a lot of money in many projects, and we didn't achieve the goal. And let's investigate a little bit one of the reasons why. So, and after just recapping, we have the continuation with the second phase of the the Doha COP. So the second commitment period comes in 2013. And then in 2015, we come up with the Paris Agreement, where a new idea come, the national determined contribution. Each country shows to others and assume a commitment about how they are going to reduce the emission. In 2024, the countries has to start the reporting of the actions they are taking. and every single 5 years they have to report it again. So it's a new mechanism. It's also connected to the cap and trade, but goes a little bit beyond in terms of a commitment of countries, not just from the Annex 1, the industrialized countries, but all the countries. Um, if I remember well, until 2020, we have 192 countries already commitment already they already presented their national determined contributions. And forest restoration, it's calling the attention of the political environmental agenda globally, because it's the most effective way to reduce the climate change, to reduce or to store, better saying, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So this chart shows how much carbon we can storage through the land use strategies, which includes forest landscape restoration. So it's much more than we can do in the cities. It's much more than we can do in the manufacturing and services. And it's also connected to other benefits like water security, food security, energy security, biodiversity. So as we are going to see, forest restoration can help climate change effort, and a lot, as we can see here, is a huge contribution to this agenda, but also is connected to other agendas. But one problem that we face it mainly during the Kyoto Protocol is the transaction cost. So the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, is not that easy to the projects to attend. The requirement are not easy to prepare, so they cost a lot, about 2,000, 200,000 per project, because you have to go for many analysis to finally get the carbon credit, the certified emission reduction. So to access this market, you have to prepare a feasibility assessment. You're going to estimate the amount of carbon you can absorb through your project. And then you have to analyze many details like the linkage. If you are going to have a leakage in your project, if you have other associated benefits, like if you are doing ecological corridor, you're also helping the fauna. So probably you're also helping the biodiversity conservation. So this is going to bring you a different price or a different buyer. You're going to attract a different buyer. So all of these you have to consider when you are doing a feasibility assessment. And then you have to prepare the project, the strategy, what's the seedlings, what's the species we are going to use, where you're going to plant, how are you going to engage landowners, who is going to measure the carbon storage. So it's a whole strategy, and you have to prepare it. So and then you register it. So authorities are going to evaluate your project. So there's a registration fee to authorities receive and process your certified emission reduction requirement. And then there's the validation. So the institution that is going to register the project have to hire a third part to go to the field and validate if the proposal, the strategy, is according to the reality. So it's a lot of cost associated, I already participate of one experience to certify a certification carbon, uh, and to go from the feasibility to the registration, we spent more or less almost 3 years. So it's a lot of, and it was a very well structured NGO in the region that was a higher demand for restoration. So it wasn't. I think that we have the skills and we have the contest to develop a good project. At the end, we sell the carbon, but it was a very long process, and the upfront costs also, they are high, but after you also have to sell, so you have to find buyers to your project, which is also not easy task. You have to avoid, you have to consider the risk of mitigation. So part of the carbon you calculated in your project have to be separated to mitigate some problems, like you have the cattle come and eat the seedlings you planted, or there's a fire that you didn't expect it, or even if you don't achieve the monitoring can show you that your carbon estimation at the beginning was too high, so that you have to consider this problems that you can have in you may have in a project, and you have to bring it to the project. And of course, the cost of monitoring and verification, the cost of we forestries going to the field, measuring the trees, diameter, and so on, and height, and calculating the amount of carbon storage. So there's a cost of that. You have to count on the specialized people to do that, or you have to train local people to do that, and this costs. So have in mind that this is an average, could be much higher than that, but $200,000 per project is a lot of money. So it's not possible to see landowners taking, or small landowners association or small cooperatives like in taking the leadership of this process, because it's expensive. This, of course, you have to expend upfront, and there's no guarantee that at the end of the process you're going to have a good price. Talking about price, you can see here the price of carbon along the last 15 years. So it changes a lot. Depends of the agreements. For example, after Paris Agreement, we saw that the price is going up, but also depends of macroeconomic issues. And for example, if you remember, in 2008 we have a huge economic crisis, so it impacts the price of carbon, not just here but along the way. So yeah, the carbon pricing is regulated by the market, and the market is regulated for many other factors. So the price level along this 15 last years, along the last 15 years, vary a lot, from 1 to 139. Of course, there are some peculiar issues connect to a project. For example, a project that brings benefits to that you describe in the project, and you show that the project is not the carbon, but also bring benefits to the community, benefits to biodiversity. This carbon, the price of this carbon is higher than a project that doesn't have the same strategy. So the project per se, the price of the carbon is going to be different, depends of the context of the project and the strategy of the project implementation, but also the carbon pricing vary a lot, depends of the economic context. So, but taking just to to have an idea how much cost, how much the transaction cost means in terms of CO2 equivalent. If you got like this is a high price. If you go through the history of carbon pricing, you're going to see that it's very difficult to achieve this price. So, but let's consider $25 per ton of CO2 equivalent. So making the accountability, we'll need at least 8,000 tons of carbon to cover the costs, the transaction costs, just to pay those. Is not connected to implementation. It's just transaction cost to guarantee that your carbon is certified and to be able to sell it to a buyer. Yeah, 8,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. Here, let's consider more or less how much 1 hectare of forest could absorb in terms of carbon, so we can have an idea about the transaction cost in terms of hectares. So I'm bringing some data. It can. This paper is very nice if you want to have an idea about the amount of carbon different types of vegetation could store. I do recommend to have a look on this paper. But here you can see that it could vary. It varies a lot. Depends of how old are the forests. Depends of the location of the forest, the strategy, if it's a natural regeneration, an agroforestry, if it's a mangrove. So depends a lot of things. I made a huge average. It's like a roughly average, and I'm considering like 5 tons of CO2 per hectare per year during the first 20 years. That is more or less the amount of period you have to guarantee to the seller that the carbon is going to be stored. So 1 hectare is a forest this is again is a roughly average. So 1 hectare of forest can store 300 tons of CO2, which is going to, we can translate the cost, the $200,000 in hectare is going to be more or less 30 hectares. So here I'm bringing some costs associated to the implementation of the forest restoration projects. It could vary a lot from 2,300 to $48 per hectare. It depends of the strategy you adopt, and of course the strategy is going to depend of the level of the degradation and the amount of forest in the landscape. So if you can go for planting the seedlings, which is the most recognized and known restoration intervention, but you also can use the other strategies as planting seeds or conducting natural regeneration. But let's take an average, again, a rough average, a roughly average of $1,000 per hectare. So the 13 hectares from the transaction cost, we have to add more 30,000 because it's the implementation. So you can see that there are many costs involved on that. And the carbon price is going to influence that a lot. If you cannot reach the 25, all the numbers I'm showing is going to be much higher. Oh, let's bring some reflection about the discussion about the carbon pricing. The first one is that the RED mechanisms they required complex projects and long-term ones. So, and it's complex because you have to align a global procedure to certify your carbon, with the local strategy to plant trees. And you have to make all those connections through agreements. So you have to have an agreement with the landowner to plant the trees or to do the restoration or to implement the restoration strategy in the lower level with them. You also have to have an agreement with the many authorities in the national level, and this is costly and involves a lot of articulation and also a lot of skills to design, because you have the social strategy, you have the commercial strategy to sell your carbon, you have the ecological strategy to make the cheapest as possible but more efficient in terms of making the regrow the forest. You also may need some specific ecological skills if there are other issues concerned to biodiversity. Maybe you have some concerns about water security. So it's complex. The project is complex. And it's just economically viable for large scale projects. So it's not possible to imagine a smallholder like buying or spending $200,000 or 200,050, consider the implementation cost, to certify his 100 hectares, which is not a smallholder but a medium, uh, to certify or to certify and sell the carbon credits. So it's a clear limitation of this mechanism. You also have to consider that the carbon price floats according to many issues, as we discuss. And sometimes you are develop a project thinking on a price, and when you are able to sell it, the price is much lower than you expected. So you have to change your strategy, or you have just to wait for the right moment. So that's why I highlight here that this is high risky, because sometimes you spend a lot of money develop the project as and then you cannot find a buyer because the market they are, or you cannot find a buyer that wants to pay the price that you make that calculation to certify and implement your project. Another thing that we are going to explore later is who are the main beneficiaries. So when you go for the climate change agenda, of course that everybody should be interested on that. But if you don't show to the local landowners that they planting their trees, they are going to have some benefits on that, maybe um, it will certainly bring some negative aspects to the project implementation. If the local people are not engaged, it's going to be very difficult to implement your project. So it's obvious that you have to bring to the strategy of your project very clear actions to improve or to bring some benefits to the local landowners. And now, as we are going to see, we also have to consider that force and force restoration brings more benefits than just for carbon storage. So we are going to see it now, but it's also important to have in mind not just to put in the project, but also to consider other strategies to raise the funds that you need to implement the carbon or the restoration strategy. Carbon is could be an important source of funding, but it's not just the only one. There are more fundings concerning about other important issues as water security, for example, biodiversity, that can also help you to raise the funds you need to implement the project. Talking about these other force and force restoration functions, the first one I want to highlight is connected to water security, which is hydrological function of forest to filter and to help the absorption of the water in the soil. So we call sponge and filter effects. I'm not going to explore it here, but I'm letting a reference here so you can, and there are many um, papers about that. Is a huge discussion about that. Scientific researchers are measuring the effect of the water infiltration in different types of soil from different types of vegetation, and also the effect of filtering sediments and also nutrients from the field to the water bodies. Another one is the economic products that forests offer, timber and non-timber products, right? This is a very interesting reference. You can find this reference on those publications. But in the researchers, he made an accountability of the size of the the forestry market influence on the U.S. economy, and he found that doing the economic accountabilities that the forest-related business support over 1 million direct jobs in U.S. and generate over 55 billion indirect payroll. So it's a huge economy. We are not talking about um, something that is not important for economy. So forest products are very important. Just look around and you're going to see how many materials you have from or furniture, food, and many things that comes from forest. And of course, forests are very important for people who live inside the forest. So over 500 million people depends directly of forest. So a forest is a house for many people. Forest and forest restoration influence on the hydrology, the water security. It's important for the economy, big economies like US, and if it's important for 500,000 people, so it's clear that the ecosystem services that forests and areas being restored, forests being restored are important, are connected to the quality of life of people, to the well-being of people. And the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment publication that comes out in 2005 is a milestone because it was the first time. Well, there's the Constanza paper before that, but here was the first time that this connection between ecosystem service provision, forest restoration, preservation, conservation, those strategies connect to also to the biodiversity preservation, the biodiversity value are connect directly to the our well-being. So that's why this publication is so important, and also they bring a price for that. So how much? Of course, this is a reference because put a price and something priceless as biodiversity is a huge. There's a huge debate on that, but the most important thing of this publication is to make this connection clear and put a price or put a reference economic value for the forest, for the biodiversity, for the ecosystem services provided by nature. And the value of that connect directly with the quality of our lives. And based on this clear connection between ecosystem services provision and well-being, so come up the idea of the umbrella of nature-based solutions. It's like if our quality life depends of the quality of the environment we live, which is very clear for everyone. But as I said, the Millennium publication brings it in very connected and showing the economic value of that. So the conservation and of force of natural vegetation, the conservation of nature, and the restoration of areas, the great areas, to a situation similar or providing more or less the same functions and services of this area. Uh, it could be a tool for many of our problems. So nature-based solutions are basically strategies connected to conservation and restoration, roughly speaking. And doing that, you are connecting to the Sustainable Development Goals, supporting ecosystem services, and the provision ecosystem services, helping to regulate the ecosystem, the offer of ecosystem services, and also connected to here very clear all of them are connected to well-being, but also the cultural value of ecosystem services. Connecting the natural-based solutions is connected to many global agendas, from carbon to biodiversity, from sustainable development goals to the risk reduction. So here I just bring some of the strategies. So the ecosystem approach is basically to think and how does all of these are nature-based solutions. So the ecosystem approach is a strategy about how to manage, how to improve the quality of the ecosystem management to provide better ecosystem services. Forest landscape restoration is pretty much connected to design a landscape or to planning the process of improve or enhance the quality of the landscape based on actions to increase the forest cover and so on. And there are many other strategies. If I'm not wrong, there are 12 nature-based solutions. Basically, all those solutions are going to act in different places of the landscape and different strategies, sometimes more connected to conservation, sometimes more connected to cities, the role of the forest in the city, sometimes more connected to the production, bring to the rural areas um, forestry, and of course making clear the role of the forest in terms of providing services, for example, pollination, or just a place to contemplate, to rest. So, or to increase the productivity of fishes in the rivers, to protect rivers. So many nature-based solutions could be applied uh, for different situations. And for example, I would like to highlight sometimes they call natural infrastructure, sometimes is the green infrastructure, but those two strategies are pretty much connected to the water security. And is the idea here is to have a match in terms of actions to offer the water supply continuity for big populations. So nowadays, or until a few years ago, the main driver to guarantee that was the gray strategy or the gray infrastructure, basically huge investments to make dams, to store the water in reservoir, to provide it but now we have seen studies showing that it's also important to combine the gray and the green uh, strategies to provide a long-term or to reduce the costs of the gray infrastructure and also the risks involved on this kind of investment to guarantee the water provision for a long period. So in that case, is just I would like I'm highlighting this example because the green and the natural infrastructure is a nature-based solution that combines the the gray uh, the gray infrastructure, basically pretty much on the civil engineer approach, with a more ecological one, which is rebuild a forest or preserve conserve forest and located in strategic places to do the functions the hydrological functions we already discussed, that is to help filter sedimentations and also to improve the water infiltration in the soil. So we have seen that an evolution of the concept and the importance of the forest restoration in the global agenda. That that's why the forest restoration is calling attention. It's more present in the media and in the speech of many authorities. And is interesting that it's a mix. As the forest restoration is gain momentum, is gain importance on the global scenario, the concept of forest restoration also evolved, also adapted to different interests. So at the beginning, the idea of a forest restoration was to recreate. It's like, oh, we destroy a forest, we degrade a forest. So through a forest restoration, we are going to return as much as we can from the conditions, the previous disturbance condition. So that was the in the 80s 90s, that was the idea of restoration. Like, I'm going to go back to the situation that it was before. It was a process to assist the recovery of the ecosystem that was degraded. Here we can see that, okay, maybe it's not possible to return to recreate the same combination of species, the same structure of the forest, the same biomass, the same relationship between fauna and flora, but sometimes maybe it's possible to assist the process of recovery of a degraded or damaged ecosystem. But then we saw a jump in this century. We saw a jump in the concept. So the restoration is concept changed, and it's pretty much nowadays focused on to accelerate the ecosystem, or natural relationship in the ecosystem, to accelerate the recovery of this process. Thinking on three main categories, which is the health. So here we are talking about ecosystem services, the function of the forest, or the function of an area in process of restoration of ecological relationship. The integrity is also important, thinking on the species composition and community structure, not anymore thinking about to restore exactly what was damaged, what was degraded, but to create an ecosystem where the species composition can interact each other to maintain the functions and to maintain the provision of the environmental services. And sustainable also is that the same composition of species has to be able to absorb impacts and rebuild naturally if it happens. So the three main concepts around the definition of forest restoration nowadays are those three: health, integrity, and sustainability. So when you do restoration project, when you restore a piece of land or a landscape or whatever, you have to have those three main principles, let's put this way, in your mind. And here is just another way to see how the concept of forest restoration evolved along the time. So at the beginning, as I mentioned before, it's pretty much focused on ecological fidelity. Let make the the biological composition goes back that we were before, in terms of structure, function, and composition. And then we move it for more efficiency. So there's a cost to do that, and the cost is very high, and the failure is also high. So it comes from a phase of, okay, let's think about how can we reduce the cost of that, and then the more I would say the current approach of forced restoration also involves other social, political, moral, and aesthetic concepts that we are going to discuss later when I present forest and landscape restoration, the forest and landscape restoration concept. About the forest restoration strategies, we also we can go for a more passive or more active strategy. Passive would be abandon the areas, and we have many examples around the world about that, where due to economic reasons, landowners abandoned the areas, and the areas that was occupied by agricultural land becomes forest. They restore by themselves. It's a natural process. It's passive, no intervention. But in another extreme side, you also can have like active restoration, which is basically implies to plant trees, to plant seedlings, to do interventions in terms of direct intervention on the area. So, and but here in the middle we have a range of other restoration strategies that could be also work combined in the landscape. So it is going to depend of the ecosystem resilience. If you have a, a natural matrix, of course, the passive uh, strategy is going to be more is going to be easier to implement than if you have if you are working in a very degraded landscape. So land use history and the context, not just the ecological context, but the social and economic context, all of those factors are going to influence on the restoration strategies you are going to adopt. And of course, the strategy also going to be influenced by the goal. If you are focused on biodiversity, or if you want to get some returns in terms of timber products or no timber products, if you are focused on a specific ecosystem services as carbon as or water security. So depends of the goal, it's going to influence in the species you are going to adapt, in the places you are going to, in the sites you're going to do the restoration. So it's also going to influence in your strategy if you go for passive or active restoration. And of course, the budget, the skills you have in the landscape to work on the restoration actions, and the time frame. You have like 2 years to do the project, or if you have 20 years to do your project. It's all a combination of factors that's going to help you to define the restoration strategy to be adopted. And of course, all those forest restoration strategies are based on the process in practice and the restoration process in practice. Most of people, when we talk about restoration, forest restoration, they think about this strategy. So let's okay. If we are going to do restoration, we have to plant um, seedlings, but we can also plant the seeds. We can also count of the seed bank. We can revolve the soil to stimulate the emergence of seeds that are there, if there are some. We also can count with the birds and bats to disperse seeds. We can also can count with natural seedling bank and the regrowth of trunk and roots. So based on those different processes, um, we can define a cheaper and most efficient strategy to restore a specific site. So it's just to bring some ideas about how can we define the actions to implement a restoration process. And here I would like to bring this discussion, which is a very interesting discussion that come up in 2010, 2009 by Richard Robbs and other researchers associated to him, which is the novel ecosystem. So here we have a chart that shows the historical, or let's put this way, the natural ecosystem, and then a hybrid ecosystem when the people start to manage it. And then we go for a novel ecosystem that is something that's completely new in terms of species composition, structure, and if you look at the forests in many places in Europe, for example, if you go back to the forest, the original forest, they are in terms of a composition, distribution, structure, biomass, they are probably different from the forest that we have nowadays. But in a period, we have a hybrid situation between the original and the novel. And this is a natural process of lands where people are. And even naturally, this process, there are some papers showing that this process can happen naturally from one situation in terms of species, distribution, composition, from a situation A to a situation B. And that this is easy to think about that when you consider the climate change. Because if the temperature, the regime of rain season, if all of these are changing, of course the historic, the natural force are going to change for a novel situation that we don't know in terms of composition and structure of fauna and flora structure. So there's a induced process by people to come to go from the natural, the historical situation to another one, but also as a natural process, an evolution process from here to there. And most of the projects, the restoration projects, what they are trying to do is to get here, because here we can have like a degraded land as a novel ecosystem, right? So the idea is to bring this novel ecosystem back to the historical, and most of actions to plant trees, to revolve the soil, to whatever. Many restoration strategies focus on bring from the novel to the historical, but there are some situations that there are some thresholds that if you pass through, it could be biological or even structural or biophysical, that's not possible to go back. So there are some situations that is possible to restore the ecosystem structure and function, but there are situations that is not possible to bring this to restore the structure and function. Then you have to think in the strategies how to better occupy this land in terms of ecosystem services provision. So that concept of novel ecosystem is kind of is an important concept to reflect that there are some lands, depends of the level of degradation, that's impossible to restore, to even recover the structure or the function of this area. So we have to think beyond. So how we are going to occupy the lands that is not possible, that cannot provide the same ecosystem services they provide before. And this is part of our job when we are restoring a landscape, thinking about, and this is not just ecological issues, but also economic and social issues that may influence to in the maintenance of the novel ecosystem, or rethink how you're going to use a specific land that has a high economic value. So, jumping to I got just the five main myths of the restoration ecology, forest restoration. Um, just to bring this reflection that sometimes we think that restoration is a solution and it's easy for many problems, but we have seen that sometimes it's not possible to restore. You have to think in the novel existence of something that wasn't there, a new composition and of species that's going to occupy in the better way or more efficient the area. So the first myth that I want to bring is the carbon copy, that we can restore or create an ecosystem that is a copy of a previous. So that's not possible. Ecosystem as the creation or the evolution of our ecosystem is a huge amount of fauna, flora, chemical, biochemical, biological relationships. So it's not possible to restore an ecosystem as it was previously. Of course, the restoration work try to or use the best tools we have in terms of species combination, distribution, composition to make to increase the probability of the species relationship provide the ecosystem services and be sustainable, be able to reproduce by themselves and to be resilient to external impacts. But there's no carbon copies, like there's no recipe, so you cannot do that. So it's pretty much based on adaptive management. This is a key word when you think on restoration, because if you use the same species composition in two areas aside, the restoration process are going to be different. So you have to keep monitoring and evaluating the quality of the restoration and do some adjustments if is needed. Second myth of restoration ecology is called the field of dreams. The idea here is that if you have the chemical physical conditions, the system, the plants and animals are going to colonize it and is going to restore the the conditions you have previously in terms of a function and in structure. But we already know that it doesn't work like that. You have to have the source, the biological source, around to reestablish the ecological functions and the structure. The third myth is the fast forwarding. So that the ecosystem can be accelerated. Of course, we can somehow accelerate the process of restoration, including the right species. If you choose the right species to the conditions, the soil and climate condition you are planting, so you can have like a floristic model of succession, the ecological succession model, but there's a limit for that. There are many issues we just don't know, or many factors that we cannot control. So the best thing here, again, is the adaptive management. We do the intervention, we evaluate the intervention, we understand the species that are developing better than others, and then you keep introducing new species, you keep based on the results of the monitoring, keep improving the area until you restore all the functions you are looking at. So the cookbook, this is very common in restoration projects. It's kind of you have a recipe, you go there, plant this list of species, or do these kind of activities, and voila, it's restored. But it's not like that. we are dealing with many stochastic events, so uncertainty is there. So again, adaptive management is very, very important. And the last one is the Sisyphus complex. You know, the story of Sisyphus is a guy who take the rock into the top, and then the rock goes down. This brings the idea that if you restore the system, if you are in a restoration process, so any kind of a moment of the trajectory of the restoration, the system can go back. I already had some experiences on planting pioneer species that grow fast. And because we didn't plant like secondary species that is going to grow a little bit is going to grow after them in the lower velocity. If you don't have like many species that are going to occupy different niches in terms of not just soil but the structure and velocity of development, so the system can goes down. In that case, I was mentioned about the area will be stored with just the pioneer species. After 15 years, the pioneer species, they die, and as we don't have the secondary species, the system goes back in the opposite direction we imagined it to go. So nature has a contribution to people, and when do you identify this contribution in the stakeholder with the stakeholders, you are basically connecting their social needs with the biodiversity and other functions of natural ecosystems. So what we have learned about forest restoration so far is that in terms of benefits, we have many agendas that the forest restoration always considering the myths and the problems to develop a restoration, the complexity of developing implementing a restoration project. But by doing that properly, you can contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity conservation, ecosystem services, local livelihood, because some species could bring some no timber and no timber products, economic gains, food security, and well-being of for people. But to do that, it's you will just, and we are going to see it in more detail later. But this is just possible if some outcomes was achieved previously. This is a whole process. So in order to get this, you have to have social mobilization. You have to build the capacity locally. You have to understand if the intervention that the proposed intervention is cost effective. Maybe you have to work in the landscape scale, and you have to have the monitoring, and sometimes you just have to innovate to find new ways to develop your restoration project. So it is going to involve many capitals, from the skills of people to social connections and financial, of course, to support the action, and also the natural capital, as I mentioned before, the sources of seeds, seedling, and any other animals to help you to bring the sustainability to the area. And there are many enabler conditions to do that. We're not going to enter in many details, but governance, a way to define the rules, the monitoring system between different interests, between different stakeholders, institutions to support each supply chain, which is we are going to see later. The seeds and seedlings is not so available, so we also have to think about on the restoration chain from the seed to the forest per se, and sometimes this is not so clear. Stakeholder engagement, thinking about partnership, a public and private partnership, and alignment with different interests through many scales of government and also sectors, mainly the sectors that are connected to land use as agriculture, mining, urbanization, and forestry, of course. So, just giving you a brief example how we can work to connect social need to ecosystem services to bring local people and to bring local people engaged in the restoration process, in the restoration project. So let's suppose that we have some ecosystem services. Just giving an example, water, clean water, or yeah, let's take clean water. And here we have a social need that is to live with a proper water to do agriculture, but also to feed livestock and to support our daily life. But one day for contextual and intrinsic factors, there's that situation, people start to realize that they really need the forest to provide what the water they need. So the social needs and the ecosystem service, they get together, and when people realize that this is an important issue to guarantee, they are going to become agents of transformation, and they are going to trigger actions to restore and to preserve natural areas. So people engagement here in this very simple scheme are mobilized because they recognize that ecosystem services are part of their needs. So they mobilize to change the landscape, to act. So, and also we have a very interesting and important, I would say, movement and also publications. It was very recent, which is the Intergovernmental Social Science Police Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, what you call IPBES. So, and they developed this scheme that basically shows how the mobilized people could act to change some drivers of deforestation and land use change. So here we have the drivers of the drivers that could change the landscape for or degrade the landscape. Many activities here, human activities, could lead to a land use ecological situation that reduce people's well-being. So, and then people actually have to realize that it's happened to be mobilized, and this is the leverage the levered points. So first thing is to embrace diverse vision of a good life. Probably if you discuss for a half hour about what's a good life for you is going to be different than from me and from the landowners from any place in on earth. So find a common view of a good life is also to find a common view of a good land use management. This is important. So, and here goes many activities until we arrive in the practice. That is actually people moving towards the landscape to change it, to improve it according their values, their interests. So education is also very important. Innovation, investments, of course, new technologies to support the intervention of people. So this is an interesting scheme. I do recommend you to access this publication. The link is here. Just click here. You're going to access this publication to go deep in on these mechanisms that could help we, our technicians and also articulators, to help people understand the nature contributions to people, which is basically the connection of between social needs and the ecosystem services. Realize, understand the ecosystem services and the importance of them to our lives. Now, moving forward, we are going to enter and discuss a little bit about the forest and landscape restoration approach, what it is, the definition, how it happens in the landscape, and finally discuss challenges to implement it and its principles. So the definition, we can find many different definitions about the forest and landscape restoration, but basically when you talk about landscape restoration, there are three things that you have to keep in mind. The first one is about regain ecological integrity, and I will substitute integrity for functionality because as we saw before, it's very this is very ambition goal to have a to regain ecological integrity. You can regain work on and restore an area to regain some functionalities, like for carbon storage, for like to make a ecological corridor or to work as a green infrastructure, but regain integrity is much beyond. So I will substitute it to regain ecological functionality is one. So enlarge the amount of forest in the area, improve the quality of these forest remnants in terms of biodiversity and structure and biomass sometimes in some situations, and also at the same time enhance human well-being. So, and we are talking here mainly for local people, improve the quality of life of local people to guarantee a social ecological system that can support the ecological integrity, and because people are managing the landscape, so if you don't guarantee um, benefits for them, is going to be very difficult to maintain the ecological integrity of the areas we restored. And another important concept we are going to explore, we are going to see more detail in the principle, but is the concept of landscape. So landscape means that you are going to define a border, you are going to specify the locus that you are going to planning your intervention, the place you are going to identify the stakeholders, identify the fauna and flora species, the water resources, everything. So it helps us to make a better plan and also to adopt better adaptive management actions when you have like a very clear defined boundary of the place you are working to. It's not the boundary of the place, the site we are going to restore, but the landscape where there are many sites that we are going to restore through different techniques and approaches. So, forest landscape restoration is a mosaic of people and biodiversity interests. So, here is just a scheme that shows how many different interventions you can have on the landscape to kind of support or bring the many different stakeholders' interests engaged to actually improve the landscape as a whole. So you can have actions connected to conservation or to forest management or restoration or even productive activities, but in the places that is more suitable to that, and also identify the areas that need some actions to be restored. So this is a mosaic. So it's not just one action. It's many different actions coordinated to guarantee the whole the quality of the whole ecological social ecological system. So basically, FLR is about restoring productive and the function of a landscape or of a specific place. So imagine that nowadays we have in the given landscape, the land use is based on agriculture, agroforest, forest, and many degraded and deforested land. So through many actions, that's the future vision that we have to agree with the stakeholders to come up with specific action strategies. For example, intensify the production of agriculture, like improving incomes and also reducing the openings of new areas for that end. Restore into production kind of using a mix of native and non-native species to, for example, eucalyptus, to promote some economic income or some kind of income for people, for local people. We store into the mix system. We store into forest, thinking on areas that you may need to have more attention in terms of biodiversity or infrastructure, green infrastructure, and also, of course, avoid the deforestation. So many actions to change the scenario from the situation today to a wish situation in the future. So for be able to articulate well-being with the improvement of the landscape, the forest landscape as a whole. So, and the forest landscape restoration is being present in many agendas. There's the bond challenge that was launched in 2011, which mobilized more than 60 countries to commit on restoring 170 million hectares. So those countries are already committed in implementing their forest landscape restoration agenda. A lot of money are coming to support, and now the expectation is with the starting of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, much more attention, money, and political will come to this agenda for actually leverage this agenda and to face the many contemporary problems like climate change, loss of biodiversity, and so on. Those we already talked about. So, but forest and landscape, we saw some myths about forest restoration, but when you go in the scale of the landscape, the challenges are much bigger because we are talking about stakeholders' interests, and they have many interests, and sometimes they are clear, sometimes they are not. So the challenge is to implement an agenda that's going to change the way people use the land is a lot. And the idea here is to explore a few of them. So the first one, this paper I do recommend you to read. It's The authors, they review many restoration projects all around the world, and they come up with a list of challenges and recommendation to overcome those challenges. And this table is from this paper that I do recommend you to go. So there are some challenges, that is the connection between the goal of the restoration project with the expectation of the stakeholders. Sometimes the goal doesn't match with the interest of the stakeholders. So a big obstacle is the lack of the stakeholders' involvement, lack of communication between the social needs and the benefits that communities needs in their land. So the project doesn't kind of ignore it. The project don't. There are many projects that come with the speech. Oh, we are going to plant trees here to avoid or to tackle with climate change issues, and it's going to be good because we are going to improve the biodiversity and so on. But this is a speech for another scale, not for local people. And sometimes people just don't buy in the project because they don't recognize their needs in the project. So the process of articulation bring people together, different understand the interests on the land use management, and bring them to the table to discuss a plan is very, very important for is a big challenge, and also of course important for the project success. Another important obstacle, I'd say, is the short project and funding duration. So as you can imagine, a restoration project is very long. We are talking about 10 years, 20 years, maybe more, to guarantee that the ecological functions are reestablished. So, and most of the projects, they fund for 3 years, 5 years, and that's not enough. Sometimes the funding is so small that is done. You can even spend money on the monitoring. So all the adaptive management could be compromised if you don't have like data about the evolution of the areas you are intervening. And we are not just talking about the growth of the seedlings and all the ecological process, but if the project are achieving the interests of the stakeholders, because you can in the first moment mobilize them to do the actions, but if the result of the action doesn't correspond to their expectations, probably they are going to jump out of the project, and that's going to be a problem for the project development. So it's very important to identify indicators that are capable to see if the many interests of the stakeholders are being achieved or not, and if not, how to take adaptive management actions to to move the trend of the project to that direction. Another thing that I mentioned at the beginning, and we have seen that in many projects, and this I didn't expect to see that in the paper, but shows up, which means that is something important worldwide, is the lack of the seedling production, mailing native species, and the seeding is not written here, but the seed resources, with the seed source is very important for any restoration project, and is not that easy to find regular purchase of seedlings. So that's so difficult to maintain groups of seed collectors. So, and all of these challenges, problems that people are facing to implement forest restoration project could be avoided if the principles of restoration, forest and landscape restoration, were being followed, which is the first one, focus on the landscape. So define the boundary and try to identify the degraded area, the social actors, the stakeholders, and the available resources that you can count to thinking to restore the landscape as a whole, as a social ecological system. The second one is to engage landholders and support participatory governance. So bring people to take part of decision is a way to guarantee their engagement on the actions and the understand about the actions being done by the project. We store multiple functions for multiple benefits. Sometimes the project is pretty much guided or answer for a funder, a donor interested on biodiversity or climate change, and you design the whole project to attend this demand. But as I have seen, there are many more interests in the landscape you have to consider. So sometimes you have to, and in the landscape, there are different sites to be restored, and each one of them may respond to a function or different benefits. So consider the multiplicity of restoration intervention, not just for one single purpose, but each site could attend different purposes. Maintain and enhance natural ecosystem within landscapes. This is pretty much consider the areas you already have, as we saw in the myths of the restoration. It's very difficult to restore a land and to bring back the conditions of a native area, a forest remain. So it's much more valuable you maintain, you protect in terms of biodiversity and ecosystem service. Of course, it's much more valuable you maintain, you preserve a forest, old forest, than to restore like twice the size of this forest. So always consider conservation and preservation of forest remains as a strategy of the restoration as well. Tailor to local context using variety of approaches. Again, this is pretty much about engage stakeholders and adjust your strategies, your restoration strategies, to tailor the local interests. And then here is also connected to participatory governance that we already mentioned. And I have talked a lot about that. The manage adaptively for long-term resilience, which is long-term resilience is long-term, and which means that you have to have data, keeping monitoring your actions, not just the ecological indicators, but social, economic, and maybe political indicators that allow you to adjust the route of the project according to the local interests and according to the windows of opportunity that is going to appear along the trajectory of the project. Well, takeaway message after this journey here, we have a few messages to take away. First, forest restoration can be a tool to alleviate many wicked problems, not just climate change, not just water security, not just biodiversity conservation, not just food security, maybe all of them together. The forest restoration, and mainly when is designed to attend or to restore a whole landscape. So you can have different interventions to attend different interests and to deal with different wicked problems. So RED projects are complex and require large scale. So we have seen about the transaction cost and all the complexity that is to implement a project of this nature. Conservation and restoration are the main natural-based solution. It can fit different interests or could be more connected to an ecosystem management or to a green infrastructure or to a landscape restoration. But basically, translating to other words, we are talking about conservation of forest or vegetation, nature vegetation, and restoration of them. Forest restoration concept has evolved along the time and it has many myths. Remember the myths of the restoration. Forest and landscape restoration focus on improve nature's contribution to people, connect social needs and environmental services. This is one of the main messages. The most crucial challenges to implement FLR agenda are local communities' engagement in the decision making and also in the implementation of the project. Equitability benefit sharing. This is quite important to keep people mobilized along the process of the restoration and after to make the best use of the land. And of course, monitoring for adaptive management. It's not possible to take decisions about new actions or changes in the project route if you don't have collected data, processed data, shared data, and reflect about the data to take the best decision. So monitoring is essential. That's it. I hope you enjoy the content, the shared content. My last message is that, well, back to me, I'm doing my PhD, and my research is pretty much trying to connect social innovation with forest and landscape restoration initiatives in Brazil. So if you are interested in this topic or any other issue we discuss here, please contact me. My mail is just over here. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to see you in the chat conversation in the forum. Bye bye. Thank you so much.